Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me on behalf of the Faculty of Medical Sciences to welcome you all to this evening's Grey Turner lecture, especially to the lay members of the public who've come to hear a little bit about surgery and what's going on in surgery at the moment. And this is a lecture in honour of one of our previous professors, George Grey Turner, who was at his peak in the 1930s in Newcastle. And Grey Turner was renowned firstly for his clinical abilities and skills. He was an outstanding surgeon, and there are many pictures and records of his operations where people crowded in to watch him doing novel and new work, and his clinical demonstrations where doctors from all around the region and indeed around the world congregated to learn from Grey Turner. So he was a real contributor in the field of clinical surgery. His reputation academically was probably foremost in teaching. He was an outstanding teacher. And he probably was the father of what we call audit, looking at results, learning from them, and introducing change. So when the faculty looks at who we should invite to be the Grey Turner lecturer, we look for somebody who embodies and captures the qualities that Grey Turner himself had. And so Miss Marx, President of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, was an obvious choice for tonight's lecture. Her expertise in the field of clinical surgery is undoubted as an orthopaedic surgeon. Her background and contribution to matters educational in surgery are also without doubt following the Grey Turner model. And I'm going to go to pains to say that she has not been invited here tonight because she's the first female president of the Royal College of Surgeons, although she is, and maybe she will address some aspects of that in her talk later on. But it's a great privilege and a great honour for us to have Miss Marx Clare here today. She's not only had the interest that I've already mentioned, but has played a big part in setting professional standards, which I'm sure will be very important for at least the lay members of the audience and hopefully the medical ones as well. So as chairman of the independent review mechanism in the College of Surgeons, she was responsible for monitoring and setting standards and assisting and helping trusts and doctors in making sure that surgery is always carried out to the highest level. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Clare to give tonight's lecture entitled All Changed, Changed Utterly. Clare Marx.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear through the mic. Can you hear? No? Gentleman right in the front row, can you hear now? The mic has just come on. Yes. Okay. It's a real pleasure to come and visit you all in Newcastle. I've come from Glasgow. I feel as if I'm on a European tour coming all across the country, but it's a while since I was last here, and indeed my previous experience was coming as an examiner, and they don't really let you out of the building. They really work you very hard. But before that, I had a godmother who lived in Gateshead, so I do have some credentials, and I hope you'll accept this from a southerner. The title of this talk comes from a poem which some of you will recognise as being Yeats, and actually refers to the Easter Uprising nearly 100 years ago, 1916. Change is something that we live with every day, and for me, change is something which we should welcome and embrace. And I'm going to start by telling you what I'm going to tell you, which is that we are going to talk about themes of change, and I'm going to speak of 4 themes. The first is the theme of women in medicine, and of course particularly in surgery. The second, the change in the demography of the patient group that we're being required to treat. The third is the change in the way the patients and the world at large looks at the professionalism of the surgeons, in my case, or the doctors that are delivering that care. And this is what I call the professionalism challenge. And then lastly, the need for us as professionals to lead the culture change that will enable us to ensure that all our patients get what they really need, which is safe and compassionate, high quality care. So those are the 4 areas that I'm going to talk about. This year is 150 years since this lady, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, qualified as this country's first woman doctor. It's extraordinary to think what's happened in those 150 years. And it's also extraordinary to think of the way she had to do this. In those days, there were various ways of qualifying. Probably the most common was to take examinations from the College of Physicians and the College of Surgeons. And these were the membership of those colleges. There was also a route through the apothecaries, and you could take an apothecaries qualification exam. But the College of Surgeons in England did not let women take the qualifying exam. So she applied to the Royal College of Surgeons in England to try and take this exam in 1865, and I'm ashamed to say she was refused. It's also interesting that some 30 years later, when she was Dean of the London's Women Medical School, she asked if some of her students could take this qualifying exam, and I'm ashamed to say she was once again turned down. But it wasn't just England. I've just got to get my little barb in, because north of the border there was this lady called Sophia Jex-Blake, and she applied to the Edinburgh College in 1870 with 2 female colleagues to take the exam. And this is even worse in a way. The Court of Examiners resigned rather than examine it, just in case they passed. She actually went on to found the Edinburgh School of Medicine for Women, so quite a lady, this lady. George Grey Turner, he actually took the entrance exam of the Royal College of Surgeons in England in 1903, and he will have been one of the people who received this card in 1908. The College of Surgeons noticed that there was a bit of a ground rush of women wanting to apply to the college, so they sent out this polling card, which was very simple. It's a bit like the European referendum, I think, probably. But it says, in your opinion, is it desirable that women should be admitted by examination as members of the college? And in your opinion, is it desirable that women, after admission to the membership, should be admitted by examination as fellows of the college? Anyway, 15,000 doctors voted, and a vast majority voted no. I'm very pleased to say that, as ever, the Council of the Royal College of Surgeons decided to ignore its membership. And later on that year, they actually agreed to let women sit the entrance exam. But they said women should not be eligible as members of council or vote in any election, and so it goes on. Basically, they can pay us to get in, but they can't do anything else. And in particular, they're not going to be eligible as to be members of the Court of Examiners or anything else that the council might want to do. So I suppose it was a start. In 1911, the college admitted its first female fellow. This is Eleanor Davis Colley, whose memory is held up with a lecture theatre in the College of Surgeons. She certainly set the trail for those of us who have followed thereafter. And Elizabeth Garrett Anderson died in 1917, and it wasn't until 1926 that all the restrictive clauses were removed, enabling women to be full members and do all the duties of the college. But it actually took till 1990 that Professor Averell Mansfield was elected chairman of the Court of Examiners. So it's quite a slow progress. And of course, I was elected last year. So in the sort of story of the college, of the 214 years of the Royal College, it's taken an awfully long time for there to be any sort of female representation right at the top of the organisation. Well, what of my journey? And this was me in 1990, and I had just become a consultant orthopaedic surgeon at St Mary's Hospital, and it took an awfully long time for me to get people to actually look at me rather than the lovely man who was my houseman with whom I studied. And because I used to troll around following him around the wards, and they'd always turn to him for the answers. But in fact, I was at Mary's for 3.5 years, had a wonderful time, did quite a lot with the undergraduate medical students. It was really a great way of starting a career. But I decided in 1993, I had actually decided I ought to go and live with my husband. So I changed jobs and went to work in Ipswich, which was probably the best move of my life. So my journey is this. I was the first woman trauma and orthopaedic trainee in London, starting in 1981. When I went to Mary's, I was the first woman trauma and orthopaedic surgeon, although Professor Mansfield was already the professor of surgery. And then when I moved to East Anglia, I was actually the first woman surgeon in East Anglia since Boadicea, really. So I then became the first woman trauma and orthopaedic surgeon to lead the training board in orthopaedics, the SAC, that was 2001, and to lead the British Orthopaedic Association, the BOA, in 2008, and the college. But things have really changed, because what has been happening is that of the 250,000 doctors on the register, 57% of those are men, but 43% are now women, and 55% of the medical students are women overall. There are some medical schools that have more than others, but overall it's about 55%. So very soon the number of women as doctors will probably overtake the number of men as doctors. And certainly if you look at the number of specialists, starting from a low base, we see year on year the percentage of women who are actually making it into the consultant grades is really going up and up. And even in surgery, the last bastion perhaps of the male supremacy, the numbers of women are changing, and the figures are quite small here, but if I can just draw your line to the bottom line, which shows that the number of women as trainees has gone up in England from the year 2000, when it was 12%, to nearly 27%, and I think this year it's up to nearly 30%. So the pipeline is filling up along the way, and that is something that you may or may not think is good. But when you get to the leadership levels, then we're still very poorly represented, and this is a representation of the fact that actually most people aren't even thinking about the issue. Basically, they're happy with the way things are and they don't see the need for change. But with that pipeline coming along behind, with that flow of people, then there certainly will need to be changes at the top as well as further down. I just wanted to briefly mention that despite the fact we've had equal pay for women and men in the health service for some considerable time, in the third column from the left, you will see that there is still a differential between the amount that is paid to women for doing the same job as for men. And there are various reasons about that, and one of them is that, of course, women quite often tend to choose to work part-time at some stage in their career, have time off for children, and those are natural things to do, but having done that, they don't seem to apply for the leadership roles, which often bring with them the additional money that actually augments their salaries. If we look at the top jobs, compared to the armed forces, I guess we're doing really rather well, but if you look at women doctors as leaders, we're still at around the sort of 17-18% mark, although there are many, many women who are senior managers in the health service because, of course, they come through nursing and physio, and it's really the women doctors that are not well represented. Well, does it really matter? And I would say it does matter, and it matters for these reasons. If we have a talent pool, I think we need to fish for the entirety of that talent pool. We need to make sure that people who come into our profession can have really fulfilling careers and can actually achieve their full potential, and that we can benefit from that. We need a mix of clinical leaders. We need men and women, we need people from all racial groups, we need from all people with all sorts of different skills. But the reason for that is we need to actually represent our communities, and the leadership and the people in the profession need to represent the patients and the communities. We behave differently. We do. There's no question about it. And those different styles of behaviours actually are beneficial. They give a richness to the mix and to the whole environment in which we work. We know from some of the studies from the General Medical Council that women have different and sometimes better patient-centred consultation styles. So I think if I were a patient, I'd be interested in knowing that we were actually making sure that those people who had the best styles were seeing me, and women are amongst them. We certainly need some role models, because if you look at most studies about why women don't go into careers, it's very often that they don't see that it's possible to do jobs. They have no visible role models. And it costs an awful lot to train a doctor. So we need to make sure that those that we do qualify are actually able to have fulfilling careers. If you look at industry, then the performance of the board is improved and changed if you get more than 3 women on any board. So if we're looking for improved in performance on boards in hospitals, then I think it's important for that should be represented. And what are we doing as a college? This, by the way, is a representation of Henry VIII giving out the Charter of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1540 to Thomas Vickery. Only a few of these people are still on College Council at the moment, but it's but we are actually in the last year I've started what I call an Emerging Leaders Programme, and it's just for 1 year. Eventually I want this to be a 50-50 men and women programme, but in the first year what we're doing is we're actually asking women only to come and see what we do, and we're asking the question, what would it take for you to want to be involved in some of the things we do at a professional level in the college, and what is it that we can do to interest you and help you? So that's the first year of this programme, and as we try and move through this, as I said, I want it to be a mix, because I really do believe that we need to grow leadership in the round, not just in one group or another group. So that is women in medicine and in surgery, a quick canter through that. And now it's time for a quiz. What is this? A galley pot. It could be, it's a silver something. Yes, a silver. Well, it's a silver sake bowl. Why would I be interested in talking about that? I'll tell you why. The Japanese government in the 60s decided to give every Japanese citizen who lived over the age of 100 a silver sake bowl. So, let's talk a minute about healthy lifespan. How many Japanese centenarians do you think there were in the 60s when they decided to give this out? 100. That, you're not far off. 153. How many do you think they gave out last year? 2,000? 15,000? Okay. They actually gave out 29,000, and it won't surprise you to know they've actually stopped that scheme. There are actually 54,000 plus centenarians in Japan at the moment. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And they think that by 2050 there may be 500,000 people living over 100 in Japan. Now I use those figures because I saw the story about the sake bowl, and it was more interesting than anything the UK government are doing. So they've stopped the telegrams, I think, you get a postal thing. But it is actually a reflection of what is happening to our patient group. And that is going to be incredibly challenging to us as a healthcare profession. Going back to Japan, the life expectancy of a woman in Japan has gone up from 42 years in 1900 to 86.8 years in 2014. I mean, it's just a most extraordinary change, isn't it? Who knows what's going to be by the time you get to 2050? Women make up 87% of those centenarians already. That is a huge number of women lasting into their hundreds. And already in Japan there are nearly 300 people living over 110. And some of you will have picked up that last week in the Isle of Wight a lady fell over and got a hip replacement at 112 years old, and she was as bright as a button. So, you know, some of these people are incredible. They are functioning mentally and to a certain extent physically. So it is going to be a really big challenge. The other interesting thing about Japan is this. It is a population that is static, unlike our population where we have immigration and good birth rate. In Japan, they have no immigration and they have a very, very low birth rate. And so they have an extraordinary demographic. But actually, although our demography is a little bit different, we still have this problem of how do we make sure that people who are living to these extreme ages are actually going to be healthier than many of the people today. And we have enormous differences in healthy lifespan. There's a 20-year difference in this if you are living in Guildford, where it's much higher, to Bradford, where there's on average you are likely to live less long if you live in Bradford than in Guildford. And even in Ipswich, which is where I now practice, in Town Ward Central in Ipswich, where there's high deprivation, you live 10 years less long on average than you do in Aldborough, which is out on the coast and which is a popular retirement middle class community. So we know that many of the health decisions that are being made by the commissioning groups at the moment have taken into account things like smokers or obesity. But actually, that's not really what we should be worried about. We should be looking at the things that make people healthier. And the critical interventions, and some of you who may think the health service is the only way forward may be surprised to know the critical interventions that give you a better, healthier lived lifespan are actually having a job, so that's really important, being safe and secure, having somewhere to live, and this is probably vital, companionship and friendship. And it's interesting that there's one village in Japan where people live the longest of any place, and there, where originally the old people used to be kept in a back room and sort of kept away from the rest of society, they've got them out doing community Tai Chi and various other things like this, and now they're all living a much better life. And of course in Japan there's probably an element of diet as well, and the same applies to this country. But I'm not going to give you a diet lecture today, you'll be glad to know. So we know that we have got a change in the group of people who are delivering the care, and we know that the people to whom we're going to deliver that care are going to be different. And what we also know is that the people to whom we're going to deliver care think of us in a very different way now to the way they used to 20, 30 or 40 years ago. It isn't doctor knows best. It is a question of us being a partnership. And this really brings me on to my next theme of change, which is about the change in the way the professionals are viewed and what I call the professionalism challenge. You may not be able to see this slide very well, but for those who can't, bad news from the hospital, I'm afraid, Mr. Williams. They think your operation has been done by a bogus surgeon. The feet are pointing in a different direction from their head. So it's a joke, but we live in a society that no longer thinks the doctor can do nothing wrong, and that holds us to account when we don't get it right. And that's a big challenge for the professionals who are delivering care, because they, some of them have been brought up to think of it in a very different way. The public perception at the times of crisis are that doctors potentially cover up their mistakes. They collude with other members of the profession to make sure that it doesn't come out into the open, or if it does, they will in some way have their concerns belittled. Or maybe even worse, that they think in some cases the profession is indifferent to their plight. And that is an incredibly dangerous state of affairs, because if the public continue to think that about the profession, why should we actually be a profession that is viewed as a trustworthy profession? And so one of the things that we can do to actually show that we are thinking about what we're doing, that we're not trying to cover up, we're not trying to collude, and we're not indifferent, is to carry out proper clinical audit or outcome measurement. And we heard in the introduction that Gray Turner was regarded as one of the fathers of clinical audit. In fact, it's an interesting history. It was Florence Nightingale who probably did the first clinical audit. She, in the Crimea War, noticed that because a lot of people were dying, those places which had poor sanitation, they were dying more than those places that had good sanitation. And so she introduced very strict sanitary controls and reduced the mortality from dysentery, which is probably the biggest cause of death, very, very substantially. Now, not unnaturally, the data was questioned, and there were a lot of people who poo-pooed her ideas and berated and belittled her. And it won't surprise you that that's a pretty common feature when people don't like change and don't like being transparent. And in America, there was this surgeon, Ernest Codman, who in 1911 produced something called the end results system. And he worked at the Mass General, and he published his results, which were appalling. And all his colleagues said, well, you know, you're just an appalling surgeon, and we don't want you looking at our results. And they engineered for him to be fired, or he resigned or fired or whatever. And he was unable to earn a living. And despite the fact he had actually married into a good family, he was actually buried in a pauper's grave. Such was the vitriol with which the rest of the profession regarded his attempts to be transparent. And then in 1917, the American College of Surgeons tried again. They collected a whole load of results. The American College of Surgeons know how to look after themselves, and they met in the Waldorf Astoria and had a nice meeting and a nice dinner. Nothing's changed. And they reviewed the results, and they were again really awful. So they nipped down to the cellars, stuffed all these papers into the boilers, and they incinerated the evidence. And this is true. And there was no audit. So what has happened here was that you will recall there was a Bristol heart scandal where they had been collecting clinical data, and indeed people had been looking at it. And again, when a doctor tried to say that the data showed that patients, in this case children, were suffering, he was ostracized. The people in positions who should have known better refused to accept that information, and eventually he went out to the public, and he was known as a whistleblower because he pointed out that these babies were dying because of poor clinical procedures. And that was the beginning of a bit of a journey for surgery in particular. And Leslie at the front here is a cardiac surgeon, and I have to take my hat off to the cardiac surgeons because they have shown us the way when it comes to being transparent about some of our data. And so what happened with the cardiac surgeons is that Dr. Foster, which was a data gathering group, met with the cardiac surgeons. They were collecting data, the Guardian newspaper asked the Cardiac Society, who was collecting this data, if they could have that information, but they were turned down because the Freedom of Information Act didn't actually apply to the Cardiac Society. And then the Guardian asked the NHS trusts if they could have that data. And at that stage, I think the Cardiac Society said they would publish, in conjunction with the then Healthcare Commission, this data. And they have done it every year since, publishing the data for various groups of cardiac procedures and showing how people have performed within those data sets. And the result for the surgeons has been at times very uncomfortable, with headlines like "Killer Cardiac Surgeon" or a picture of a surgeon, "Is this the worst surgeon in the UK?" And it is really awful for those people, because what it means for many of them is that they are facing a situation where they're unable to practice, and they are vilified by the population at large. But in fact, they might be a better surgeon than almost any surgeon in France or Belgium or anywhere else. It's just that they happen to be the bottom of the pile in the UK. And there was one Minister of Health who made the extraordinary statement, said, I think it's appalling that more than that half the surgeons are below average. We've got to teach them something about statistics, haven't we? I think what is important is that we must learn from what we're doing. Nobody, and I think any clinician in this room will tell you that they have made a mistake. We have all made mistakes, and mistakes will continue to happen. What is important is that we shouldn't cover up, and we should learn from any of those mistakes. And this was Liam Donaldson, the Chief Medical Officer, who made this statement back in 2004. Cardiac surgery, as I said, has published individual data over the last 10 years. They have risk adjustment. That means that they can quantify how sick patients they are, how sick patients are when they actually go to surgery, and they have improved the quality of their data. And it's fair to say that over those years we have seen lots of other groups doing that. The government in general has had a transparency agenda, and we are part of that transparency agenda. And so now we publish 9 surgical specialties, and one more is coming on stream this year, which will show just how well or how badly in those 9 surgical specialties, in specific parameters, particular surgeons are doing. Now, there's lots of discussion about whether the parameters that are being measured are the correct parameters or are going to be useful for patients. And I'll give you an example. In my own specialty, orthopedics, we publish death rates following hip and knee replacement. And it won't surprise you, because death rates are so low that actually it's almost impossible to find anybody who lies outside the normal parameters. So it's a start. We're collecting data and we're publishing it, but I think that the way forward is to make sure that that data is really useful to drive changes in practice which will be benefit to our patients. It's very difficult. Patients sometimes come into you and say, will my operation be a success? And there was this wonderful orthopedic surgeon, Alan Apley, who said, success is as difficult to measure as beauty, joy, or sorrow. And while I was thinking about this talk, in 1 week, I was sent pictures of 2 beautiful offspring. Came with, beautiful offspring email headlines. And this is one. I like the hairdo, actually. So I do have parental consent for showing this. And this was the second. And the hairstyle is almost the same, really. So, and both people involved with these thought that they were beautiful. But what about success? What would success look like? Well, I mean, we think about this. I mean, success surely would be if they grew up and were normal and had successful lives. And so 6 months on, you can make your own judgment as to whether it was normal. So, but certainly growing well. So we have a problem in that when we produce data, it may not be the data that our patients really find valuable. And that is a challenge to us, to make sure that A, we produce useful data, and secondly, we make sure that the analysis of that data is something that is open and understandable and is useful to our patients. National audits can certainly raise standards. I think it's fair to say in cardiac surgery, we see that they've been treating sicker and sicker patients, and the results are getting better and better. And we have some of the best, if not the best, results from certain types of cardiac surgery in Europe. And something has been driving that change. It could be that we just have a lot of very good surgeons. It could be that this 10 years of looking at results has actually meant that people have looked at what they're doing and understood what they're doing, and in some cases stopped people doing surgery that they were not doing well. The advantage of national audits is that you get lots of numbers, so you can start to look at trends, and the individuals can see where they lie in that patch, and they can actually try and ask themselves those difficult questions about, am I good enough? Is the place I work good enough? Do I have the right facilities? Do I have the right backup? Is there something outside of the practice that I should know about? All these questions that will only be asked if we really look at the data. And it's really important that we, the profession, lead that questioning and try to work out what it is that we are going to do that makes it better. And the bottom point on this is that we know that if we do this right, led by the profession, we can make some huge differences to our patient. Again, looking at orthopedics, at the bottom, this hashtag NOF is actually fractured neck of femur. This is when old people break their hips. And we know that by looking at the quality of the care we give with patients with fractured neck of femur, coupled with a quality improvement program of operating on them quickly, having combined care with the physicians and the care of the elderly, and making sure that they're rehabilitated effectively and quickly, we know that we have reduced the death rate in this very difficult area of old people with broken hips very substantially. We've reduced the death rate from something like 45% at a year down to 30% of a year, which is a very considerable difference. And we know that we've reduced the in-hospital death rate from about 30% a month to about 10% a month. These are incredible changes driven by the knowledge that we gain from the audits. So the clinical outcomes program really is to improve, the real aim is to improve the quality of clinical care and also improve the monitoring. It's for reassuring our patient population that they are getting care that we are monitoring and we are looking at. And we know that we still have a lot to do to improve these audits, but that is something for the profession to work on. When we have the knowledge, then we can share that honestly and openly with our patients. We can have those conversations which we can feed them useful information as opposed to, I can tell you what my individual results, if you come to me as a surgeon, I can tell you how often I have to redo a hip. I can tell you how many of my patients that I fix their hip after a broken hip are likely to die. And if you ask me the question, I can tell you where I lie in the pack as compared to other people. And that might be useful to some patients when they're trying to decide whether they want surgery or not. And that is the way we get transparency. There is a small sort of additional bit, which is that when we come to talk to the GMC every 5 years about renewing our license, this is information that we can present to the GMC as evidence that we are up to date in our clinical practice and we are taking the whole process of reflecting on our practice in an open and transparent fashion. But as you can imagine, we get challenged a lot about this. You know, people don't like their figures being out in the open. They say that the data isn't right, the risk adjustment isn't correct. There are questions about how we get consent from patients to use their data in these things. And there's a question about how it should be presented to the public. And of course, as I mentioned already, the media love it when they can put something out saying this is the worst surgeon in the United Kingdom. And does that sort of behaviour from the press actually encourage surgeons to take less risks? Well, I've already mentioned that the cardiac surgeons seem not to have been sufferers from this. They're operating on these people who are getting older and older and sicker. But it could be that actually what happens by publishing the data, rather than risk-averse behaviour being a negative thing, it's actually a positive thing because it encourages people to work in teams. If they don't have the facilities to do operations, it encourages them not to take a punt and have a go. It encourages them to try and speak to their colleagues about difficult cases and make sure that you have everything available for them. And it encourages organisations to work out who is going to be best for these procedures and how we're going to actually achieve the best for the patients. There's a lovely story that I would end when we're talking about outcomes. Ernest Codman, the American College of Surgeons, recognised his contribution to outcomes measurements, found his unmarked grave last year and erected this headstone to mark the grave of somebody who, as with Gray Turner, was the American father of outcome surgery. So it does take a while for surgeons to realise the good of looking at things. The best safety device in healthcare, though, is almost certainly the profession. And this statement was actually made by Dame Janet Smith at the Shipman inquiry in 2005. We know about what our colleagues are doing, and it's for us to actually address the issue. And whilst I was chairing the invited review mechanism for the College of Surgeons, which is a peer review institution, we looked at the themes that came out of all of these reviews we did. And it won't surprise you perhaps to know that individual and team behaviour were always key to poor performance of a particular department and nearly always associated with poor patient outcomes. And those behaviours impacted on outcomes because essentially people found it difficult to deliver a safe service if you have poorly performing teams and bad behaviour amongst some of the members of that team. And it's those poor behaviours that then interfere with our ability to deliver the sort of care that we aspire to deliver. And it also made it very difficult for those teams to actually improve on their clinical outcomes by carrying out proper quality improvement processes. The people who are detractors say to me, well, show me the evidence. Well, I can tell you, we looked at 30 invited reviews. We looked at all the factors within those reviews, and we showed that in 80% of those reviews, the poor behaviour of individuals or teams played a very significant part in the fact that those services were not delivering safe care. But what was interesting is that in 50% of those reviews, we found that a lack of leadership or poor leadership was also a very, very important part of the poor performance of the whole environment. So that brings me on to that last theme, which is the change in the culture that we need to lead for the future. Michael West is an organisational psychologist, I think, but he works for the King's Fund. The King's Fund do a lot of work in healthcare. And he says this: leadership is the most important influence on culture. every interaction by every leader in healthcare shapes the culture of the organisation. And I think that is the challenge for us, to make sure that we are leading in an appropriate fashion. And I don't mean this. This is not, follow me lads, we're going over the top. But actually, sometimes what I do mean is that these are the people that we have to deal with. Because basically, dealing with poor performance, and I'm afraid to say it's sometimes in our senior colleagues, is probably the most important job that we have to do. We need to make sure that people understand the value of team dynamics, of good behaviour, and of their role as a member of that team. And poor behaviour disrupts that. And that is a really big challenge for all of us who are in leadership roles. So this is what I say: every healthcare professional must display a willingness to take responsibility and work with others to be part of the solution. Not the solution, but you can be part. Every single person, whether you're a cleaner to a leader, you all are part of being part of the solution, of making the whole of the environment safer for our patients. We've published from the College of Surgeons Good Surgical Practice, and in the foreword I wrote this: my measure of what I would want is, I'd be happy to be treated this way if this patient were me or a member of a family. And if that's the sort of standard we set ourselves in every interaction that we have with every patient, then we are going to actually be on the right road to make sure that we're delivering the sort of care we really want to do in partnership with our teams, and of course in collaboration with the patients who come and seek our care. So if I can summarise, we have a workforce in medicine that's changing. We know that the patients who will come and seek our opinions and look for our care are going to be changing and producing new challenges for the whole system as they age, and with that aging they become more complex and have many, many different challenges within one patient. So it's the multi-morbid patient, I think, is the way people are describing these days. We know that you and the patients will be challenging us to change the way we relay the information and the way we behave. This professional challenge to us as a profession. And we know that there is a challenge to the way we lead the service in which we can deliver that care. And I think that as we bring a change in the people who work in the service, so you will see changes in those leadership styles, and also open up the debates about the sort of professional behaviours that we see in our workforce. So perhaps I can just finish with my journey as it has gone along. I'm still on a learning curve. It's been pretty vertical in this last year as president of the college, but I still try to learn something new every day, and it's one of the great energizers of my life that it is possible to learn something new every day. And I think if all of us set ourselves a target as professionals to try and do that, it would not be a bad start. It means that you do actually look out and see what's around you. I'm a president, but I'm also a daughter, and I've got two parents in their mid-90s, so I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about changing demography. But I'm also a wife and a dog lover, and you know, all of those areas of my life need nurture and care. So as professionals, we shouldn't be ashamed to admit that we have a caring side to our nature, and we should get in touch with that caring side as we try to think about the changes we need to make in the service that we're going to deliver. But I suppose most importantly in my journey, it's this business of fun that I really want to try and sort of put out as something for people to think about. It's been a huge privilege, and it is a huge privilege to be president, but it's also fun. And I think that when we regard our profession and our professional lives as being fun, because it is so overwhelmingly absorbing and such an energizing process and such a privilege, then we will have the attitude of mind that means that we are in a position to ensure that we can deliver the sort of safe, compassionate and high quality care that all of us aspire to, and be part of this great endeavour that is the NHS. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and I'm very happy to take some questions now, or these are my contact details if people feel they would prefer to email me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam President, Clare, Miss Marx. That was a truly thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation, and I do hope that both members of the public and of the profession have a greater confidence that the leader of our specialty in surgery has got her head screwed on the right way and knows what matters. She's very kindly said that she'll take questions, so this is your opportunity. I know there are some medical students in the audience. This is a big chance to ask the President of the Royal College of Surgeons directly a question. There are also some leaders in the audience. It's a great opportunity for you to ask the President some questions. And we've got somebody up there in a high-vis jacket. Yeah, go ahead.
Is this switched on?
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Helen Vint. I'm one of the orthopaedic trainees in Newcastle. So I feel it's my responsibility, sitting in a room full of very interested lay people, to bring up a rather difficult topic. And that topic is one that a lot of you have been reading about in the broadsheets potentially, and that's the potential privatisation of the NHS. We look at the daily demoralisation of doctors, my junior doctor colleagues, worried about the new proposed contract changes. We look at the public's trust in the NHS and doctors being eroded day by day. Jeremy Hunt's comments about 7-day working. And my question to you is, in 10 years' time, do you think that there will be an NHS for me to take care of the men and women sitting in this room?
Did you hear that, sir? The question, fine.
Okay. I am confident that there will be an NHS. I think that it is the most valued institution that this country has, and there is no politician that would be able to do anything but to preserve it. It may look different, and indeed it probably should look different in some of its features. I think the challenge for us as leaders is to make sure that some of the issues that you've alluded to are actually led professionally in terms of the change. And as a College of Surgeons, our charitable purpose is to advance surgical care for our patients. And we know that the things that are likely to help advance surgical care is to have an energized workforce, is to have a well-trained nurse workforce, is to have a workforce that feels valued by a recognition of their skills, is, and I mean this is a slightly personal point, is to have a workforce that values the women in the workforce, because you can see how many of those are coming along. And those are things we're already engaged in talking to government about, and trying to actually get them to understand the profession's view of how we can train people better, how we can recognise their skills better, how they can feel more valued within that profession. I do think, though, that there are some really interesting questions, and that is that sometimes the profession itself doesn't want to change. And I'll give you the example. If you walk into a hospital at weekends and go to a ward, how many doctors do you see on the ward? There are nursing staff there, but how many doctors do you see on the average ward? And what we know from the National Emergency Laparotomy Audit is that we still have patients who go for surgery, sometimes the sickest patients, without the benefit of a senior doctor and a senior anaesthetist. So none of us would like that for our family all of us would like to know that we were getting the very best available care. And so we are going to have to make some changes. So instead of just putting up the tide and saying, no, we don't want to change, we have to be very much at the forefront of trying to make sure that we lead those changes. And at the moment, the impasse between the government and the British Medical Association is not a good environment for anyone, least of all the profession, who stand to lose out almost as much as the patients themselves, because further sort of batting in public between these, the government and the Medical Association is likely to actually make the profession look particularly but weak and bad. So I think it's a real challenge, but we are up there trying very hard to represent at high levels on the high principles of training and value and recognition of women and various other things in there.
Yes, madam. Sorry, there's a microphone on its way to you.
Hello. I'm a member of the public, but I did work as a community manager in the NHS for a while. Closer to my mouth. Okay. What I was wondering is, how do you balance the professionalism and the desire to improve with the public's desire to have a hospital on every doorstep? Yeah. And it came out particularly, I thought the whole cardiac thing's been marvelous, except when they try to say, well, we don't have enough children who need surgery, so we'll have to close Leeds or Newcastle. As soon as they say we'll choose to keep Newcastle, Leeds goes up in arms and says, you can't possibly close it because it's just down the street and my son was treated there. And I find that whole dilemma, everybody expects perfection on their door, whereas I would rather travel 100 miles and get a surgeon who'd done 100 operations than 2 miles and one who'd done 2 operations.
So it's really interesting. There have been a few branches of medicine where the recognition that volume creates a difference has been transformative. So I'll give you the example of stroke management or cardiac management or trauma management. So if you look at the outcome data from the major trauma centres, and you have one here in Newcastle, we are starting to see hugely better outcomes for patients with major trauma when they are brought to trauma centres than they used to be. There's no question about it. And in the end, I think the clinical data and the outcomes measures will speak for themselves in many areas. And there's more than that. And you have to be able to sustain the arrangements you have. And if you've only got 2 surgeons and they're on a 1 in 2 and they're on they get lots of patients coming in, that won't be sustainable in the long run. What's also clear is that we have to recognise there are some places like north of Scotland, which are very remote and rural, where we have to provide a service. And that service is either something that can happen there, or we're going to have to provide a helicopter service to shift those patients out. I mean, if you're in Yellowknife in Canada, you get airlifted to a big centre because you're just so far from anywhere. So there's some parts where you make choices to have it locally, and you also know that the standard won't be so high. And there are other areas where you remove the patient to somewhere where they can have that high level of care. And that's a public debate which has to be informed by the profession. And the profession are really bad about this because they don't want to change. So if you look at Manchester, where the surgeons are taking out a judicial review, even after all the conversations that have happened, we are our own worst enemies when it comes to actually trying to improve patient care, because we like the hospital we've worked in and we don't want to change. So I think that's another leadership challenge for us as a profession, to actually try and say to people, you really have to be armed with the real knowledge of the outcomes, and you've got to accept that if there is really good evidence that for your patient's sake you need to change. It is a problem.
Yes, further question. Microphone on its way.
Lord Warner resigned from the party whip today, and it reminded me of some comments he made in a Guardian article a couple of months back, saying everyone was going to pay a tenner a week for the NHS and 20 quid a night, like it was a hotel sort of service. What do you think? What do you think about those comments, and what do you think about the future funding of the NHS and how we're going to have to change its structure to account for the demographic changes that you've mentioned?
So I'm not familiar with the particular quote. He's a Labour peer, isn't he, Lord Warner? So
He was.
He was. Sorry. No, he's still a peer,
Oh,
but,
right, okay.
but he's not Labour. He's not.
Party.
He's resigned the Labour whip. But the issue of how the health service funding is funded is something which I can tell you there have been working groups ad nauseam over successive governments. The reality is that we could spend probably the entirety of the GDP on trying to fund the health service, and what we really need to do is to turn our view to how we stop people getting ill. So, you know, we should all be on the bikes, we should be having better diets, we should, I mean, if you look at the recent sort of job losses in the steel industry, how are we going to make sure that those people who lose their jobs get some sort of job so that they can be maintained and have healthy lives? These are really difficult social questions and are probably as important as what we do in health. If we can change the burden of diabetes, the burden of obesity, all these other things that are feeding into the system at the bottom end, that's going to be almost as important as to what we do at the top end. But then there is a question, what should we provide as a health service? That is in part for public debate, and there is another public debate which will come around the next time you have an election. This country has just elected a government that ran on a ticket of low taxes, so it's maybe not our choice, but that's what the country elected. So to a certain extent, they have to have that debate with us the next time they come to election. They can be held to account, and if we don't like what we've done for the last 5 years, there's a tick box that you can vote for Jeremy Corbyn, who I sat next door to when I went to the Labour Party conference, as it happened. And
Well, on that note, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we are running short on time now, and I know that you will want to join me in thanking Clare Marx for coming to Newcastle to deliver the Great Elder Lecture, which she's given a very, as I said, thought-provoking and thoughtful talk, and I hope that we'll all go home with confidence that the head of the surgical college in England is looking after our best interests. Thank you very much, Clare.